President of the Association of Political Science, faculty, and my dear friends and ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to meet you in this fashion, sir. Uh, and to set the stage for today's talk. Um, as we've been seeing how conflicts around the world have been increasing on a day-to-day basis, we find the aggression or the belligerence of China, which is very much seen at a time when the world is battling with this COVID pandemic that has come to us. In the context of the topic today, a brief background to maritime disputes, which began around the 20th century when states began legalizing the idea of maritime domain. The relationship between states and maritime space had significantly changed. Additionally, by the turn of the millennium, there has been certain global trends that have brought an amplification of the role of the seas in terms of international affairs, thus bringing in a renewed focus upon maritime space, the rights and responsibilities of states in this domain that is marked by the concept of boundary at sea. What is maritime boundary? Why do states engage in disputing such boundaries? Or we can raise the question, how do states work out possible solutions to such disciplines? How can we better understand the legal and political principles that frame such engagements? Maritime disputes across the globe has grown at an alarming pace where countries have become more concerned about their marine resources ever since the world economy has largely become dependent on ocean-based resources that we generally call as blue economy. In this context, according to principles of international law, states have become increasingly aware of their maritime boundary that they can utilize for exploring and exploiting the available resources. Maritime boundary dispute is an alarming issue over all the world. The countries are now becoming very much concerned about their marine resources because the world economy has turned into ocean-based resources termed as blue economy. So every coastal state is aware of their maritime boundary for exploring and exploiting its mineral and food resources. According to the law of the sea convention, the length of territorial sea is 12 nautical miles, 24 nautical miles for contiguous zones, and economic exclusive economic zones, which is about 200 nautical miles from the baseline. But practices that show that a larger limit of the different maritime zones is existing among states. In recent years, no international maritime dispute has garnered so much attention than the contest over the islands, reefs, and waters of the South China Sea. The dispute involves the overlapping claims of six governments to territorial sovereignty and maritime rights, encompasses the main sea lines of communications that connect South Asia with Northeast Asia, covers large fishing grounds, and may contain vast reserves of oil and natural gas. In the South China Sea dispute, no state attracts more attention than the People's Republic of China because of its expansive claim, past uses of force over islands in these waters, and its growing naval capabilities. So it is in this context when Zhou Enlai issued in August 1951 during the Allied peace treaty negotiations with Japan. In the statement, Zhou declared China's sovereignty over Paracel and Spratly Islands. So when we look at all of these issues, there are many other things which come into mind. And so in the present scenario, the arrival of the world pandemic and the ever-growing aggressiveness of the Chinese in context brings us to certain questions that need to be examined. Why have countries such as the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, to a certain extent, joined hands to counter the growing belligerence displayed by the Chinese? Number two, why have the Chinese chosen this particular time while the world is battling with the problem of controlling or finding a vaccine for the coronavirus, which is bringing an ever increasing number of deaths in the world, and while the world is crashing in terms of each country's economy? Why does China engage in such aggressive behavior while it knows too well these actions would only increase hostility towards it, as seen in many countries' decisions with regards to Huawei banning of apps, pulling out of many companies, and finding suitable venues for their reinvestment? With these words, I set the stage for the lecture and look forward to the speaker's remarks. So may I take this privilege of inviting Professor Sakuja, one of my very senior mentors in terms of research and international relations, to deliver his lecture. May I invite you, sir?
Thank you, Hans, for the very kind introduction. Professor Christopher Chandran, I think it's a unique honor for me to speak to your students. And of course, it's also a pleasure to meet you, of course, virtually. I mean, that's the order of the day. Probably we are into that world now, digital world. We all are adorned, if I may say, with the cell phones and those devices. So I guess conversations such as these have now turned digital. So that's fair. I think the circumstances as such. And Hans, thank you very much for inviting me. And I chose to speak
The
on
pleasure is
naval
mine, sir.
turbulence. Sorry, can you
The
hear?
pleasure is mine.
Yeah, thank you. I chose to speak on naval turbulence in South China Sea. After all, it's sea. And as a mariner, having sailed through these waters, literally about, let me put it this way, about way back in 1995, 96, over 2 decades ago. And I realized they were placid and calm. They were very nice areas. We flew over certain islands. And that time Scarborough Shoal was, the issue was coming up. There was this rock, and it was fascinating to see that these, over so many years, rather decades now plus, that you find that these have gained international attention for all the wrong reasons. And I realized that over the years, for the last uh, since 2002, we find that this area is gathering momentum in terms of geopolitics, geoeconomics, geostrategic issues. Not to forget, there is also the whole issue about environment ecology. I mean, it comes with a generous mix of lots of issues. And there are hundreds and hundreds or thousands of scholars who are working on South China Sea, bringing up the historical context to contemporary issues, developments, environment, underwater, communications, whole lot of things. I find that it is the most studied subject as of now. Of course, there is issues about sustainable development goals, the Sendai framework. All these are there, but then this is in terms of geopolitics, geoeconomics, I guess, geostrategic issues. South China Sea is the so-called they say it is a flashpoint. Yes, it is to some extent a flashpoint, but then there are certain checks and balances. And then I realized that is there a connection what's happening in South China Sea and what's happening in the Himalayas? I found some kind of a recall by China of certain things or actions or policy measures which it draws liberally from South China Sea to the Himalayas, as also vice versa from the Himalayas into South China Sea. I mean, there is a crisscross. I recall attending a conference on South China Sea in Vietnam, and that time I said the things are almost getting similar in the context of Arunachal Pradesh. And there was a sharp reaction from the Chinese scholar. He says, "You're stretching your imagination too far." And I recalled that paper and I realized, no, I was right. Later, it has come to haunt us, this very, very issue. So what I thought, before I go any further into looking at South China, see what's happening over there, I thought it would be useful to just to flash the map, because that's important. That'll give you an idea. I must take you back into your classroom. Page 4, 5 of the atlas that you used to have in our school bags, right? That would have the oceans of the world or the seas, and that was a useful picture to tell us where the social. Shruti, can you share that map for very, very quickly?
Yes, sir. Yes, I'm just sharing it.
Okay.
Is it visible, sir?
No.
So now?
Yes. Yes. Perfect. All right. Now, I suggest we leave the map on. I think this is useful because I've got you, everyone's around, and I can see. Now, if you look at this map, there is Indian Ocean referred over there. And if you look towards the extreme right, it's the Pacific Ocean. Going back to classroom, school book, and the atlas that used to say. I marked these with certain, before I go and start using this map, I must also say this is a map which is borrowed from one of the paper. So intellectual property right lies with the authors of that paper. All right. So this is a caveat, not to be used for any other purposes. All right. So now you see these circles and you see these broad lanes or narrow passages which have been made out. I mean, there is Straits of Hormuz, there is Straits of Bab el Mandeb, then you have the Mozambique Channel, then you have plenty of these small little circles and big circles, Straits of Malacca, 6-degree Channel, Sunda, Lombok, and variety of other Makassar straits which are there. Now, it is this geography that I'm going to talk about, beginning from east coast of Africa all the way into Western Pacific. And if you see Philippines, South China Sea, Philippines, towards right, we don't see there's a place called Guam, the islands of Guam, Marianas, and the whole lot of towards Hawaii it is. All right. Now, this is the geography that I'm going to play around with this, what's happening over there. And there's a very, very important space of which Indo-Pacific, I guess Indo-Pacific has become a kind of a subject of study at the college itself. And several of you are learning about what's happening in the dynamics. But my focus will be now moving from Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and then keep bringing that back in and out. So we're going to sail, as I say. I'm a mariner by profession, right? Having served in the Navy for about 26 years. So I'm familiar with this, that we're going to straddle on both the oceans here and there, and then cross through the Straits of Malacca. Now, before what's going on right now, it's important what was happening last year. Is it different? No, not really. As a matter of fact, last year I kept watching and monitoring what was going on in South China Sea. I found a series of things happening. And first there was, the exercises were between India, Japan, Philippines, and the US. Not in South China Sea, but in areas north of South China Sea. All right. One wondered why Philippines. This was an odd actor. Normally, big powers would come join together. But I guess this was to socialize smaller navies also to join. It was a kind of a, let's say, a socialization process that smaller navies also have a role to play, while big navies have, conduct their activities. Then we also had somebody, exercise called Pacific Vanguard. This was between US, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. Then there was a third exercise which was going on, that was between the French had also come in and they brought in their nuclear aircraft carrier. Then the Australians had fielded their submarines. So in a sense, what was happening in that part of the world was plenty of naval activity, or for that matter, if I may say, naval exercises. And the Chinese call them as naval drills. So it was a very, very busy place. It continued for several days. And then it was not just that what was happening. Meanwhile, in the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, if you come back to Straits of Hormuz, there was also a lot of activity which was going on. That was between Iran, Russia, and China. And the Iranians, of course, under tremendous pressure from the United States and the European powers, sorry, they conceptualized a new trilateral joint naval exercise called Maritime Security Belt. Now, the Iranians were bold enough to suggest that this is the new triangle of sea power in the region. So there was certain turbulence. Then they invited, that is China, that is Iran, Russia, and China. They invited Pakistan to join, but it refused because it was already engaged in certain other activities. But for Pakistan also, they introduced another set of exercises, what they were doing called as Aman series of exercises. Then they were also conducting bigger exercise called the Maritime Security Patrol, which was coming down into the Arabian Sea. I think that was the time the Indian Navy was on high alert. So what you see is that plenty of naval activity which was going on over there. Now, what was seminal about these exercises, that the geography of these exercises was changing. Indians were carrying out exercises in South China Sea or north of South China Sea. The Americans were all over. The French had come all the way from the Mediterranean to exercise in South China Sea region. Right? The Germans were thinking about it. The Japanese were, the Australians were moving. The Chinese had come into the Arabian Sea. Russia. So they were all coming out of their comfort zone, and there was certain signs to suggest that things are not going to be all that pleasant, or they'll be unpleasant, because there were too much of turbulence, too much of naval activity which was going on, which was rather unusual, as I would suggest. Now, what was also happening simultaneously was the quality of platforms. That is, now they were bringing in, fielding in bigger platforms, such as aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines here. Then there were usual ships would come in, task forces were coming in. And if you were to look at a swath beginning from east coast of Africa all the way to Guam, east of Philippines, there was a lot of naval activity. And I realized that it was fair to say that the Indo-Pacific was churning, and there were too many exercises which was going on. But then came the pandemic. February, by February, let's call it January, 31st of December, 1st of Jan, we were now familiar with COVID has come in, and COVID, and there was certain activity. One would assume that there was focus homeland, into the homeland. Things were, the navies would stand down. They were now preparing because they had to safeguard themselves, because men on board, because you have on a ship for a carrier, you'll have for the US, it'll be 4,000 people, and they're most vulnerable. And in the case of the United States, they had called at port in Vietnam, Da Nang, and sure enough, thereafter, a series of the cases did emerge of coronavirus infection. So this is what was going on. But February, I found that there was a certain churning which was going on in the South China Sea Taiwan Strait area. Now you can see Taiwan Strait, between Taiwan, can you see Taiwan north of South China Sea where it is printed, and right on between that, the Chinese had set out their task force. Now there was purpose for it. They would argue that there was too much of pressure which was coming in from internal pressure coming into from China, and the Chinese to deflect pressure, that is internal pressure, domestic pressure. After all, Wuhan, 80,000 people had been infected. There was a lockdown, shutdown. The Chinese decided to conduct naval exercises to essentially to intimidate, if I may use quote and unquote, intimidate Taiwan. They deployed fighter jet, bombers, and then this prompted Taipei, which had been somehow managed to control the COVID and had been warning that way the COVID-19 was unfolding on mainland China, and then it was only to intimidate China. And the Taiwanese advised them to focus on the epidemic. And as a matter of fact, the Taiwanese leadership admonished admonished Beijing for inciting nationalism at home to shift public focus away from challenges at hand, and label it as a game not worth the candle. So this was the beginning. We started watching this very, very carefully, what was unfolding. The Chinese Navy was out. And also, there was also a purpose that the Chinese Navy wanted to showcase that they were battle ready. They could conduct business, while the US was now in the process of having cases emerging on board their carriers that they were what one would say as COVID-19 affected or inflicted. They carried out patrolling all along. Air Force was involved. On one occasion, they intruded into Taiwanese airspace, but the response was very quick and sharp from the United States. The Japanese also came out. The US response was something phenomenal. For the first time, they put out 3 carriers in the region, coming from mainland US to the Pacific. Of course, one was already deployed in the region, and one was in Japan. And they carried out 2 carrier operations, which is very, very unusual and unique way of doing things, because 2 carrier operations are much more complex. As it is, carrier operations with so many aircraft flying is very complex. But here was an opportunity to showcase that they were able to conduct 2 carrier operations, notwithstanding the COVID. They deployed nuclear submarines. They also deployed strategic bombers coming in from mainland. They were deployed in Guam, and there was plenty of naval activity from the US side. Then there was also something very interesting happening back home on mainland US, that the US decided to invoke Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative. It's called acronym as Taipei. And they also brought in Taiwan Defense Act. This was again to intimidate, again, to counter the intimidation that the Chinese were planning to do. And the US, Washington, planned and announced $180 million worth of military aid to Taiwan. The third issue which was turning over there was that the US also announced something called as Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or the PDI. Now, PDI was similar to what was called as the European Deterrence Initiative, which has its genesis in Europe and was targeted against Russia. It was essentially when they're going to put in lots of fiscal resources for building up military infrastructure. Now, this was again a kind of a pressure tactics by the United States on China. And sure enough, they responded and reacted in terms of that. This was again a coercion of sorts. US also started augmenting military infrastructure on lots of these islands, what they call as unsinkable aircraft carriers. And in naval parlance, we will call them as lily pads, from which they started. And these were all, as a matter of fact, they were not new. They all had been in use during the Second World War. So you were getting a sense that what was happening in the Pacific was a screenplay of what was happening during World War II. The Pacific was the one. And then all this while, my understanding was that the entire Indo-Pacific discourse that we were talking about for the US, the primacy is the Pacific, not the Indian Ocean. Yet they would talk, they have a strategy. As a matter of fact, the command, the center, the training center in Hawaii called the APCSS Center is also renamed as Indo-Pacific Center. But then the focus was on the Pacific, and that's where even now that continues. So you find that the US is investing an enormous amount of fiscal resources, building up capabilities, infrastructure, as a matter of fact, trying to bring in so-called the missile defense shield for Guam, for Hawaii, and a lot of naval investment besides deployment. They also deployed all the way up north in Alaska bombers. So you find that, and of course, they marshaled in the Australians, and also deployed the Marines from there. So what you found was very, very interesting. There was a pressure which was being built up by the Americans through infrastructure development, through operational maneuvers, through processes and procedures and policy. Then there was also big events which were happening in terms of the quadrilateral security dialogue. Now, we found that all these years, we are familiar with the quadrilateral security dialogue. It's a dialogue amongst the four, as they say, it's a D4, democratic four countries, that is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. But then these four have been, preferring their exercises to be held sometimes in Bay of Bengal or go to Guam area or into Japanese water, but never ventured. But here, there were some signs that they would also now looking forward to coming into the South China Sea, put pressure on that. Now, these Chinese have been worried about the Quad for a long time. They've been saying this is a kind of a Asian NATO. And if you see the strategic discourse, which is now evolving, there is a reference being made in terms of a formation of a new Asian NATO. And I'll talk about it a little later, about how this is all unfolding. Now, there was also trends in terms of code of conduct. Now, code of conduct, which started as draft code of conduct way back in 2002, I recall, looking at 2002 code of conduct. 5 years later, 2007, that time I was at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, and there we were debating that 5 years of DCOC, draft code of conduct, which the Chinese and the ASEANs had come forward with, that it has served its purpose, it is benign, people are working, it may be a slow pace, it may be the ASEAN way or the Chinese way. But then 5 years after 2000, we found that the whole code of conduct that they were talking about had evaporated in its own, what it was meant for. So code of something that the ASEAN now were pushing forward. Now, code of conduct is a very, very important document for the ASEAN. Now, they believe that this brings in a certain amount of commitment from the Chinese who have signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, right? And they also, it brings in a lot of comfort zone for the ASEAN, because then they can tell, look, everything is to be resolved in a bilateral fashion through diplomacy, etc. Of course, diplomacy is the most important toolkit of the ASEAN, right? Now, code of conduct was another one which had been dragging on for a long time, and the ASEAN were placing a lot of pressure on the Chinese that they come in, and they were literally dragging it for a long time. But what happened was a very interesting statement, and I must share that with you, that the Philippine Foreign Secretary, he goes and to say that he denounces illegal provocation by the Chinese air patrols in South China Sea and say, if something happens that is beyond incursion, but is in fact an attack on, say, a Philippines naval vessel, means that I am going to call up Washington, D.C. This was a threat to the Chinese, that don't be adventurous in South China Sea. If you get too aggressive, I'm going to call up the Americans. All these years, there has been a debate in Manila in terms of looking at their so-called the Defense Pact after the Cold War was over. The status of forces SOF SOFA state of forces agreement was shelved. Americans were embedded in Philippines, but now Mutual Defense Treaty (MDT) is now being invoked, but with new coinages. Of course, under Duterte, there are a lot of stresses and strains. How far he wants to go with the Chinese, or how far he wants to go with the Americans. Now, what we notice is that there was a lot of pressure coming in. And what has happened just 2 3 days ago at the 10th East Asia Summit, Secretary of State Pompeo, he has assured all the ASEAN countries that they are there with them. He has, through another document, and which was put out in month late, I think 29th or 30th of July, that he set out that the Americans, for the first time now, articulated that all these years they said that we are not involved in the dispute, but for the first time they challenged Chinese nine-dash line, the historical claims in the South China Sea, and said and stated that they do not believe in the Chinese arguments, and they were ready to take on any kind of eventuality. Now, this was a very hard-hitting statement which was made public. Secretary of State Pompeo made these remarks, and it'll be useful if you can read those. They're available on the web. And that had set a kind of a like cat amongst the pigeons, where the Chinese were not taking note of what's happening. There was pressure. The Chinese came up front. They said they're willing to now talk, get the code of conduct for the ASEAN, what they were debating. All this might put it on a fast track. Now, all these years, I've given you a picture that it has been turbulent for the last February, mid-February onwards to, let's say, it is still continuing. There's nothing called as, placid calm waters. Incidentally, at this time of the year, the South China Sea remains turbulent, also from the weather point of view. And having sailed in the month of August and September in that region, I find it is a very, very difficult stage. The frequency of what they call as hurricanes or storm surges is phenomenal. Intensity goes up, frequencies have increased, and it is not a very pleasant place to sail in. So it impacts on operational readiness of any navy for that matter, or on the operations as such. Now, what is all this happening? Now, Chinese are under tremendous pressure. They have conducted the reclamation of these reefs. What began, if you see those pictures, if you go back to 1995, 96, all these reefs, before the Chinese started their big works, which have come up now, they were building up small little shacks on stilts made of bamboo. So bamboo stilts, and on top they would put up these little so-called shacks of sorts, and they would position people. Must have been those who were deployed over there, soldiers. They must have a harrowing time. I mean, there's nowhere to go to. You're just stuck in that, let's say, 12 by 12 place. It was not easy. But then the Chinese sustained it. Then over a period of, they started building. It's a good idea if you start looking at those pictures from 1995, 96, and then look at contemporary. I think that's a change. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised knowing the Chinese one fine day, they already started sea cruises from mainland to South China Sea. And now they're bringing in tourists to come to visit these facilities. We want to showcase nationalism, that we've done this. We can build infrastructure. One thing for sure, you have to give a lot of credit to the Chinese of their ability to build infrastructure. And those of us who've been to China, and I go there several times, I realize the quality of infrastructure, the stretch of the infrastructure is just simply phenomenal. It is fantastic. It is fantastic that we have to take it for granted. So it did not come as a surprise that the Chinese were able to reclaim land, these reefs, shoals, and then build up this kind of an infrastructure. Now, these reclamations and their subsequent military build-up, has had some international response. Now, what has happened is, in the bargain, I mean, this didn't happen overnight. And sometimes, I do accuse friends that you all started it. As a matter of fact, before the Chinese built infrastructure, the Malaysians built up infrastructure on an island called Liang Liang, or the Sparrow Islands. The Vietnamese also built up. The Filipinos also built up. Taiwanese had Itu Aba had hit it. So everyone had it. Only later that the Chinese started it. But be that as it may. But now what has happened is with this reclamation build up, we're finding new coalitions and partnerships have emerged. Now, of course, I did mention to you about the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is up and above. As a matter of fact, we first started QSD way back in 2007. 10 years later, we pulled it out of the dustbin because it had been put to control or DEL for a while because of certain pressures from China. But then we pulled this out, and now QSD, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue before partners, is now up and above, and they're going to be meeting very soon, later this year. All right. The other interesting dialogue which has come up is a 2+2 dialogue. That is the Foreign and Defense Ministers dialogue between Australia, India, and Indonesia. Now, these trilateral stuffs are coming up. Then there's another interesting development which has taken place, is in the form of Australia, India, and France. Now, you see these so-called trilaterals, small mini-laterals, if we say, all right, are now mushrooming all over this region. Everybody's trying to coin, like, I said, the Iranians, the Chinese, and the Russians, they're talking about a trilateral security initiative. The French have come in. French, of course, will claim that they're an Indo-Ocean power because they have territories in the Free Union region, that is in Africa, south of Africa, in South Indian Ocean, Southern Indian Ocean. All right. Then we find that if you have noticed, if you've watched with little interest what's happening around, Germany has now sounded the alarm bell to say they're interested in the Indo-Pacific. They came out with a 40-page document, right, about what their strategies. French have a strategy. The Netherlands are looking at it. Brits have said they are going to be, of course, joining hands with the United States as part of their so-called alliance and agreements. So what you're finding is the return of European naval powers to this part of the world. It's a very, very interesting development. All these years, what was happening in the South China Sea or waters around South China Sea was Asian navies. But now you have the non-Asian navies also coming in. This is going to add to more turbulence. There are going to be more reactions from the Chinese who find that everybody's trying to coerce. The other very interesting development which has taken place is there is a Five Eyes initiative. Now, Five Eyes initiative is not new. It came about at the time of the World War, Second World War. That time, the 5 countries joined up. That is Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and United States. They formed a grouping for signal intelligence, right? And this had remained silent all these years. A very interesting development has taken. This has been now revived and reinvigorated. Now, what does it do? Very name suggests that it is 5 eyes. Eyes means they're going to be looking at things. And in this context, they find that very, very interesting that they're going to work against together, ganging up again, as the Chinese say it, against China. Then they're also bringing about very interesting changes. There is a connect between the Chinese 5G program, sale, technology, and the Five Eyes network. That is, if you notice, the Australians have said we'll not take 5G. Britain has said no 5G. Canadians saying no 5G. US, of course, has thrown 5G out of the window. All right. So you find there's a connect over there also. So there is a pressure of technology dash military dash intelligence. So this is Five Eyes is also a new initiative which is now being reinvigorated. Another interesting development which is going on is in the form of sanctions. You would have heard the US has sanctioned first 18 companies, then another set of companies, right? 24 more companies. 2 companies merit our attention. This is one company which is called as the China Communication Construction Company. It is 4 Cs. And then the China Electric Technology Group Cooperation, CET, GC. Now, these 2 companies are very, very important, and they are noteworthy in the context of the BRI. The Chinese have sanctioned them. Now, what happens in the sanction if they can't conduct business with anybody? Now, they're also very important, the Belt Road Initiative infrastructure developed across the globe. Now, any big state for that matter, there are fears, as I understand, that any country dealing with these countries through the BRI is going to be inviting a kind of, let's say, a flock of sorts from the United States. And we've seen that in the case of Iran. When the US-Iran tensions were high, they cautioned that nobody's going to deal with the Iranians. So you find that pressures are coming in. But then one of the most seminal kind of pressure which has come, and the Chinese have been demonized for this, is the ITLOC, that is the arbitration between Philippines and China, Philippines and China, which they brought it to the ITLOC. Now they found that the Chinese have the ITLOC indicted the Chinese because, and they said they violated international law by causing irreparable harm the marine environment, endangering Philippine ships, interfering with, etc., etc. You find a very interesting construct of what I would call as environment and ecology and strategy and military. Now, this is very, very complex. So, if we cannot look at Indo-Pacific or South China Sea from a very narrow prism of navies, we must look at it from a point of trade. Insurances are up the moment US carries out freedom of navigation patrol for the period, say 5 days. All right, it announces the insurance rates of ships transiting through Taiwan Straits or through South China Sea go up. At the end of it, when these goods land at, that is, you and I, when I become users of these, the costs have gone up because shipping is now paying a lot of taxes for this. So it is military, it is insurance, supply chains, it is in the form of environment, ecology, human development, whole lot of issues. It's a very complex issue, but then that's why I said there are thousands and thousands of scholars who are working on South China Sea because we've got hundreds and hundreds of issues to be debated and discussed. Now, having said all this, let me come to the last part of my remarks. Essentially, why would prompt look at the Himalayas in this context? As I said, this was a trigger which I recalled my paper way back when I was reading out the paper in Vietnam on South China Sea and how I looked at it, that how it will come and react, it will be of impact on us in India. Now, we are all familiar. I'm not an expert on the LAC. Of course, we do follow what comes out. And of course, friends in the army, in the military, otherwise share good notes. And you find that it is, I think, we're heading towards the winter time. Snow is going to come in. There is no, what they prefer is called, revert to ante. That means go back, status quo ante, right? Things are not all that very, are quite unpleasant to that extent. Um, the defense minister has been to Moscow. Foreign minister has just returned. There are 5 issues that they talk about. Global Times carried a story this morning, but those 5 issues are not listed out. But they recall the spirit, Wuhan spirit, or the previous spirit, whatever, Xi'an spirit, and etc., etc. But then we are in for a long haul, as we would understand. So LAC is going to be something what we're seeing. Both sides have built up. New videos keep emerging, and you get today. I think we are better educated and better informed what the LAC is all about. You get so many pictures available to you. What is Finger 5, 4? What is this road? Where is Pangso Lake, etc. I recall writing in Jamestown Foundation way back in the 90s about Pangso Lake. That this is where first time we were seeing that the Chinese aggressiveness. This is in the 90s, right? So this has been there with us, but then 1993 talks, and tranquility, etc., have played on. But then today we find that things are not very pleasant. Now, there is a kind of belief, very strong belief, that Chinese are um, non-believers in status quo. Sometimes in theoretical context, you'll go the revisionist power, these things happen, rising power. You took it from different frameworks, you look at China, you get different answers altogether. Right. Now, here, if you look at it, that they're changing the status quo. First, coming in, of course, intrusions, incursions have been a regular feature. My army course mates do tell us, that, of course, they would have those days, they'd come in 5 people, 6 people, drop cigarette butts, go away. Then this graduated from cigarette butts, they'll put up some, volleyball net, play volleyball. After that, they started leaving some food packets or wrappings, etc. So this has been on for a long, long time. This has now moved to this level. It has not come overnight. This whole process has been on while the 1992 agreement was still on. Right. Now, we've had standoffs, at least 3. We have the last one was the 2017, now the Galwan. All right. So these standoffs have become. But what very interesting, and I want to share that with you, the Japanese Defense White Paper also makes note of and says, very interesting, it says China is moving forward with militarization as well as expanding and intensifying its activities in the maritime aerial domains, thereby continuing unilateral attempts to change the status quo and qualify further to read as coercion to create a fait accompli. Now, similar sentiments come, from the Indian side. The word status quo appears in our MEA briefing notes, and then militaries are very, very sure that this is to be, they want to change the status quo, and that we should be prepared for it. This is the situation as of now. The second one is about core interests. I think the whole core interest issue debate must be recalled when the Chinese came about, talk about what are the core interests. The national interest, the core interest. And interestingly, in the core interest, they include Taiwan, of course, South China Sea, Tibet. So what does that mean? So they bring Tibet in the same so-called basket as Taiwan and South China Sea. Now, they've been very, very vocal about it. This is a very interesting one. Way back 2009, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was to visit Northeast, and the Global Times called it provocative and dangerous move and warned that India will make a fatal error if it mistakes China's approach for weakness. It further say that India would just have to surrender the Aksai Chin plateau in Ladakh and Tawang, and the border issue could be solved. Now you see reference to Tawang, reference to Aksai Chin. Now, these are all now what we find as part of the so-called the lexicon of the current debate or current discourse, which is evolving from the Chinese side. Global Times always up with these kind of articulations. Similarly, the ASEAN also have core interests. Now, this is how core interests are now being played out. There is a kind of sometimes I would also take a step back and say maybe tenuous though, that there is a relationship between the kind of core interest that the Chinese see in South China Sea and how they look at it. But it's a good piece of study. What is their understanding of core interest in South China Sea? Will be different from core interest in Taiwan, core interest Tibet, core interest Arunachal Pradesh, Tawang, etc., etc. So this is a subject to be studied very, very carefully to come out with good arguments and good understanding to share that, okay, this is what it means. It doesn't mean it is unfair to connect South China Sea with this. But then as of now, I would still, though tenuous, but still link it over there. Now, salami slicing has been another very popular one, phrase which has appeared. Now, we find that salami slicing has been practiced in the South China Sea. That what does it mean literally? Through small, persistent acts or an enduring presence in a claimed territory. This is what salami slicing is all about. That you go, you slice it like a salami. Salami cutter, piece by piece, by thin slices, thin slices. And we find that, if you look at now in terms of what I began with, things like dropping a wrapper, cigarette butts, playing volleyball, food packets, presents, are all those symptoms of coming in. Now, what they did now at the Galwan, okay, this is mine. They come in. So it is slicing territories, etc., moving forward. Salami slicing in the Himalayas is another interesting subject to be debated and discussed about. Another interesting that I find is that economic engagement but aggressive posturing. Chinese say, let the border dispute be one side, dealing border on business. Now, B and B, for us, B and B go hand in glove. We cannot say, okay, border, we are happy with the way, or we will conduct business separately, but for business, we'll not. That's why, you saw the economic war which is going on, trade war, etc., etc. So you find that there is a kind of, posturing which goes on, and which is a feature which we find that in the case of South China Sea, of the ASEAN, again, incentivize engagement, SOPs, loans, but not yet ready to solve the South China Sea. Right. What we finally see is that, in the whole construct, these four issues, if you want to take a leaf out of what's happening in South China Sea, is plausible, and very much, I would argue that it is very much a case that we can pick this up and look in the context of the LAC, what's happening over there. I think I'll stop at and then raise questions. If you have, I'll be happy to answer those. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing with us your invaluable thoughts. I'm sure every member of the department would join me in appreciating your effort in sharing the little known facts about the South China Sea and clearly illustrating its efforts on the Himalayas. Thank you once again, sir. The floor is now open for the questions. I request the participants to kindly unmute their microphones before putting your questions. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. This is Divian, professor from political science. I had the opportunity to listen to you quite a number of times, and I had also shared my thoughts when we met at the Observer Research Foundation regarding certain naval strategies, which also I had in mind. And now in the same way, I'd like to get your opinion on the scope of the Arabian Sea. Now, when you're talking in terms of the sea lanes of communication, the end point seems to be the South China Sea, but the source of their economy is concentrated on the Gulf of Aden and the Hormuz Strait, and all the material and the tonnage of imports and exports which the Chinese make go through the Arabian Sea. So now Arabian Sea is Indian territory, literally. We can exercise much more dominance on the Arabian Sea compared to that of the South China Sea. Now, would that be the reason why for the string of pearls, the Indian response to the string of flowers seems to sprout from the Arabian Sea? Like, for example, the leasing of the islands, the Assumption Island from Seychelles and the Agaliga Islands from Mauritius, and also a listening post in Madagascar, and the proposed base in Tajikistan. And also, of course, the strong presence of the French in the choke points of the Gulf of Aden and the Strait of Hormuz, and also, of course, buttressed by the base already existing in Diego Garcia by the Americans. Now, if we can exert some dominance there, perhaps harass the SLOCs, especially the freight lines of the Chinese over there, could that draw off the pressure of the Chinese from the LAC? And perhaps this is the place where we can play the game alone, rather than depending upon the Quad or any of the Americans or Western powers, dominance which we rely on in order to exert our influence on the South China Sea. Here it is our own home territory, and perhaps some of the Chinese freight line goes in between Lakshadweep Islands and the mainland. So now that means they are coming into our own territory, that is especially the EEC. So what is your comments on these lines? Just I wanted to elicit your points on that.
Thank you. Very useful question. I think, this has been a subject which has been with me, let me say, about 30 years. And I still, since you really give such an exciting setup, and I'm only recalling that 30 years ago, while I was still in the Navy, we were still building up this map of sorts to say, this is where the Chinese Navy will be. Things haven't changed much. Those are the areas that we used to plan and think about. Today, it's a reality. The Chinese are here, all right? And it has been a success. As you look at it, I would pitch a particular seminal year of 2008, 2009 as very, very important year because 2008, the piracy had reached a kind of a high crescendo and there was international concern. Everybody joined hands and everybody came in to what? Catch the pirates, all right? And then the Chinese was now sending out their first task force for counter-piracy operation. The Chinese had made what we were thinking in maps were now a reality, that this task force will be there. And then subsequently, the Chinese submarines coming in. But coming back, now Chinese sea lines of communication are critical. Their imports are phenomenal. Their exports are phenomenal. Today, China has a large fleet under its own flag. That is important. And it must defend those. So what it does is, over such a long period, it has built up so-called what they call as posts of sorts. Djibouti, Gwadar, what you refer to as string of pearls, all right, was again a kind of a US coinage, Booz and Allen, right? They didn't have it. The word even Malacca dilemma was not the Chinese argument articulation. In fact, if you read Sun Tzu carefully, out of his 16, 17 pages of that document, The Art of War, he refers to passes. He was not a mariner, he was not an army guy, but he looked at geography and said passes are the most critical. And when you look at those passes, criticality of the passes, and you translate into the oceans and seas, those are the choke points. So in the Indian Ocean, if you go back to the map that I began with, right, the circles, small little choke points, are actually the vulnerables for the Chinese. Now, what it is, but also you must understand that while the Chinese maybe 70, 80% of their trade moves it, 55 to 60% of our trade also moves through the South China Sea. Please remember this. So it is not that you just catch hold of some ship and say, okay, I've got you. No, that's not the case. Right. Sea is a very complex issue. Law of the sea is an international maritime law is a complex issue. Trade laws are a different issue. Safety of sea lines are a very important issue. So there is a very generous construct. So what India has chosen, or the Indian Navy has chosen, what they call as mission-based deployments. These are small little spaces which they because it's not possible for the Indian Navy, with number of ships that they have, to have ships all over. It's almost impossible. And you don't put ships straight away in one direction. You have to look at, so Indian Navy has chosen certain what they call as mission-based deployment, certain areas and spaces around which they deploy the ships where they maintain 24/7 vigil. Now, as far as what you mentioned in terms of, Agalega, Seychelles, all these things. Now, these are, important. Let me put it this way, outposts. But then there's so much of activity which goes on, right, in the Indian Ocean. Military, more 80% of the activity is essentially in terms of maritime activity, commercial activity, fishing, etc., etc. Scientific survey, whole lot of things are going on. Military would be just about 20-30%. All right. But then, you monitor. We have, I don't know if you're familiar, what we call the Information Fusion Center, which is located at Gurugram, right? It monitors almost about every ship that moves in and out of merchant ship, mind you, in the Indian Ocean. So there is plenty of information which is being gathered, right? Plenty of other sources bring in. So the Indian Ocean, for that matter, which is a large, again, when you say Indian Ocean is large, but what you narrowed down, I'm very happy you narrowed it to the Arabian Sea, where the sea lines of communication are, rather converging, right? And then quickly enter into Straits of Malacca. Now, if you look at that region, I think there is plenty of activity which the Indian Navy does. It monitors traffic. It looks at suspicious activity, looks at gun running, drugs, terrorism, piracy, whole lot of things. 24/7 maintenance of ship is there, one ship is there. But please remember, it brings in enormous amount of pressure of material and men on the Indian Navy. You don't have so many, I can't say I've got 100 buses, five I put to use, five will come in. The numbers are limited, right? Sea is a treacherous place. It is very demanding. It places huge amount of pressure on humans and materials, right? So you work out useful and optimal kind of, let me say, formulations in terms of force that you want to position over there. Things may change in the future when you get into these platforms such as unmanned UAVs, right? Unmanned surface vessels will do the job, so that there's not so much of pressure on the humans, and these are expendable to that extent. Right, things will change. I think I have answered your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. That was very enlightening. I could build up a certain concept from that. Thank you very much.
So there's a question from Sandhya. Can we say that the increased participation of US in the South China Sea is increasing the aggression of China towards India?
Well, very interesting. I think you could make a case out of this. Nobody says it loudly enough, but then, you do get to hear from the Chinese media that, we are neighbors. We have to solve our problems, and which is a geographic reality. All right. You bring in outsiders, that's going to create problems, right? So there is a pressure that, earlier, it's always the case. I mean, one shouldn't be surprised of arguments and articulations because, we kept saying we are non-aligned. Even now, we say it, non-aligned principally, all right? But then we were now tagged, that time we were tagged with Soviet Union. Now we are being tagged with Russia, with the United States. I think the so-called, alliances word may not gel into our schema, in the Indian schema, but partnerships do. Today, the preferred terminology is partnership. Coming together of what they often say is like-minded states. You'll find that this is a very, very popular kind of a coinage you find in general discourse, even at the officialese level. Like-minded states come together to address common security concerns. Now, common security concerns, I think, let me also, I did not touch on this. I want you to ponder and provoke you into reading this a little more into it. We had a long period of Cold War. The World War got over by 50s or the 60s, 1962, Cuban crisis. 62 till 1990, 60s, 70s, 80s, 3 decades we spent in the Cold War, right? Cold War ended. The next decade we spent trying to figure out what is world order. Unipolar world, multipolar world, bipolar world. We spent reams and reams of paper was written on this, trying to figure out what order that we were, plus to figure out what is the order that we are going to be getting for ourselves in the post-Cold. As a matter of fact, if you look at your essays or go back into archives, the end of the Cold War was a coinage very, very popular at the beginning of every paper that was written on geopolitics or geostrategic issues. We were lapped it up because we spent 10 years trying to understand that. Then in 2001, suddenly 9/11 happens. And today, Professor, you recall 9/11, right? Now, if you look at it, very interesting. We spent a decade and a half till 2015, terrorism, piracy, drug running, gun running, non-traditional security threats and challenges. We spent a decade and a half, even not that terrorism has gone up. It is still part and parcel of the mandate of the militaries or the navies in this context. But then we spent a decade and a half, we forgot that hard security issues, which should have been taken on up front after the Cold War, we put them under the carpet. Today, I think we are dusting that carpet. Now, all this is coming up. Suddenly, South China Seas up, boundaries are coming up, states are getting aggressive. So we were brought into a kind of, I would call it a complacency, or if I may say, a kind of a trap. NTS, non-traditional security threats and challenges, trap of sorts. But now we are suddenly confronted with boundaries. What do? Sovereignty. We are into a realist paradigm. We spent the whole constructivism was the order of the day for a decade and a half against non-state actors, as the US would tell us. We again struggled for one decade in the 90s trying to figure out what is this unipolar world, multipolar world, bipolar world. We spent this, and we are now confronted upfront into a realist paradigm. National interest. What do I do? Balance of power is back in business. One would have imagined after the so-called the NTS, non-traditional security threat phase, we would focus on sustainable development goals. We didn't. We should have looked at Sendai frameworks. How do we bring about managing these issues? But we've now been tunneled into a real classic realism. Balance of power. This is what it will be. Barry Boson is back in business, if I may say, and very much in business. He's going to make a lot of dividends out of it. His bank balance is going to go up because that is what we are going to about. Regional security complexes will come up, smaller, bigger, wider. Will they have cooperative agenda? A bilateral statement, joint statement will have cooperation, cooperation, cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had cooperation overload. That cooperation overload is now like air getting out of the balloon, and we are now with another paradigm. Balance of power. You look at the Arctic, there are tensions there. You go into the Southern Ocean, there are tensions there. Nobody goes through that area. Please remember, MH370 kept searching there, nothing was found. But then still, now it is considered as a new arena. There's Antarctic, Pacific, in any case, is turbulent. As I said, Western Pacific is really the flashpoint in those many terms. Atlantic is not quiet. Indian Ocean is churning. We are back into that paradigm. The world is turbulent. Balance of power is back in business. So in this construct, cooperation is important. But then we will see, as I shared with you, trilaterals will come, bilaterals will come, multilaterals will come of a different kind. I'm not suggesting that issues of development will go away. SDGs, like a monkey on the back, will be with us. We'll have to deliver on SDGs. We have no choice. But then the scholarship is going to be of a different kind. Several of us have written papers on non-traditional threats and challenges. We brought in another domain called as the climate change, whole lot of issues, sea level rise, right, global warming. But then they all fall into the domain of so-called development discourse because they impact development. So we'll have to see how this discourse balances itself. My understanding is that this discourse on balance of power, contentious issues is rising. It's a bigger balloon than the smaller balloon of development.
Sir, can I ask a question? Sir, considering how a lot of nations have been vying to lay claim on the water bodies, and considering how and how much does India stand to lose in terms of monetary value, considering how I think over 4% or more has been the blue economy has contributed over 4% or more to, as per the latest data, to the GDP of a nation. So in monetary value, how and how much do we stand to lose?
I'm glad you raised this issue about blue economy. The subject is very, very dear to me. And having authored 2 books, and right now I'm on the task force, FICCI task force on blue economy. And we are doing the 3rd report now. And a blue economy, of course, it has got a new label. We were always looking at blue economy. We were looking at, if you see the oceans and seas, what did we use them for? Fish, food, and salt. But then as we started looking at the oceans, more science came in, seabed resources were being talked about. Then as the climate science started beginning up, taking shape, we said that what do the oceans offer us? We forgot the services offered by the oceans. We only knew goods. fish and salt. But today, if you really look at it, it's about trillions of dollars of goods and services. It's surprising that we never knew about these things. We only knew the materials. We only looked at a ship that is going to transport goods. It brings to economy, shipbuilding, livelihood, jobs, construction, technology, right? Human resource, ports, delivering. We had a very narrow view of the oceans and seas. Today, when we look at the oceans and seas, we say, no, it's much more than that. We were all taught, we all grew up with the concepts of a very famous admiral called Alfred Thayer Mahan. He conceptualized for us the sea power. It went on for almost a century, his whole idea about notion and idea about sea power, which was, of course, more tailored towards, the so-called the navies, etc., etc. Then we were socialized into a concept called as maritime power, which was much more encompassing, brought in lots of other issues, technology, brought in trade, politics, all right, diplomacy, naval diplomacy, maritime diplomacy, all right. But now we are going through a phase, what I would call as blue power. And blue power is essentially let's say, aggregation of the value of the blue economy. That means we are bringing in the issues of climate change, we're bringing sea level rise, infrastructure, risks. Important element is risks. It's all based on risk these days. Right? So blue economy is a subject which is going to be very, very, very much with us. It is, as a matter of fact, I would put it this way, in the SDGs, there is, of course, goal 14, but there are other 5, 6 goals which are closely associated with water as such. And so a narrow understanding of oceans and seas all these years is changing. It has changed. We are now looking at the oceans and seas to provide us trillions of dollars of so-called wealth. Wealth in the form of goods, right, and services. Carbon sink. Where do all this carbon sink goes to? Where are you aware? I wonder if you're aware that the marshes or the swamps along the coastline are actually consumers, or rather absorbs a huge amount of carbon dioxide. So you have a new science which tells us the utility of the ocean beyond just fish, salt, etc., etc. So blue economy is something that will be there with us. As far as India is concerned, there are only pronouncements. For the last how many years now? 5 years, I've been only hearing pronouncements. To operationalize blue economy is a different ballgame. That's where the problem starts. That is where the concept is there, idea is there. It has to be operationalized. We've been asking the government that give us a mapping in terms of what is the value of the India's blue economy. That'll be useful. I'm sure some of the students can take up this since you're sitting along the coast, right? It'll be worthwhile to say what is Tamil Nadu's blue economy value in monetary terms. How much of it is part of the so-called the state GDP? After all, it generates so much of value. It generates goods, services, employment, materials. How much is it in your GDP? Every state, you peg states in terms of the GDPs, high GDP, third GDP, fourth GDP, but we don't know the GDP, what the oceans and ocean-based industries generate, or goods and services. So valuing is a very complex thing, but I don't think we have entered into that domain. So that's what I'm saying, to operationalize, because that's why you must know, okay, this is going to generate me, say, $1 billion. So government is tempted to say, okay, let me invest to get this $1 billion. So you monetize the so-called the economy in those many terms to say, okay, this is the monetary value, and this is what it gives us. Right. So that process is not. But blue economy is something that some of you must start studying, because this is a subject which will be with us for a long time. This is something to invest in, specialize in. Write term papers will be very, very rewarding.
Sir, may I ask you just one more thing?
Yeah.
So would it be, so when you say that we haven't yet operationalized it to its fullest potential, would 4%, the 4% figure then be an underestimation?
honestly, I do not have any figure to say, okay, this is 2%, 3%, or 4%. We have not done that so-called, counting the blue economy. We have not even done mapping the blue economy. It's a humongous task, but each state must come out with their maritime atlas, which will say, okay, these are the 40 domains for which make us blue economy. Because we have not done that mapping. Only when you know what goods and services are coming from each domain, subdomain, subdomain, that this is generating wealth in terms of livelihood, environment services, ecological services. These are all can be now measured these days through certain algorithms and tools. Right? It is plausible to do that, but we haven't done it. So it is very difficult for me to say that 3% of the Indian GDP or whatever amount, or this is, we say, so many trillion rupees is generated from the oceans and seas under our jurisdiction, EEZ, etc. So I'm afraid, no, I will not be able to tell you. Of course, subsection shipping generates this, ports are generating this, but it has not been put together to say, okay, this is what it is.
Thank you, sir. There is a question in the chat box. Vidya, would you please read it out?
Yeah. A student named Rajeshwari is asking, what is your opinion on UN tribunal rejecting Beijing's claim on South China Sea?
I think they gave a seminal award. Now, this is actually, law of the sea. If you're familiar with the history of the law of the sea, we had the 1958 law of the sea. We had now a 1982 law of the sea. And very few people who were part of the negotiations of the 1982 law of the sea are alive to tell us. But whoever you talk to, they say it's a can of worms, don't open it. For simple reason that it took so many years to get that little body of law for us. It's got a lot of shelf value. There are gaps in it, yes, but then those can be addressed, right? So as of now, what they awarded to China was very much justified. Chinese didn't come up. They said, we don't agree with it. It is not just China alone. Let's not demonize China. US, Nicaragua case, right? Then you have no respect for, let's say, a law when you talk about Russians, the one of the, what was it, Sea Shepherd, right? Or Greenpeace Force ship. So there are numerous examples of it. Diego Garcia, Britain, right? So there are lots of examples of it. So what they have, as a matter of fact, awarded to Philippines is that the Chinese claim of historic rights is untenable, right? Besides, they did not appear, right? Then it has also set in motion a kind of pressure on the United States. United States has signed it, but not ratified it. Then there are issues that the law of the sea of that time, what about the national legislations? You look at our own case, we have the 1976 Maritime Zones Act. 1976, we are into 2020. Next door neighbor, Bangladesh, also has, they became independent in 1971. 1972, they had their Maritime Zones Act. Ours is 1976, mind you, right? They have come out with a new Maritime Zones Act. Myanmar has done it. We also need to do it. We've got to upgrade those Maritime Zones Act. There will always be tension of what the international law says. You have to harmonize domestic legislation with the international law, international legislation with the domestic law. Otherwise, issues like Enrica Lexi, whole lot of these issues will keep coming up. So there is going to be a kind of, as a matter of fact, I must share with you, and then when we have these opportunities of such webinars, I would send to Hans the link. There's a massive project which is on of education on maritime law, rather law of the sea, international law, right? So at the Indian Council of World Affairs, we are running a big project for the IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association, where we are the chair till December. So we're running this. We've had one national consultations. On 8th of October, we're going to have another webinar purely as to say, what is this law of the sea? What is this body of law that we are talking about all the time, or hearing it in the media, or being referred to in the papers, etc., etc. Right? So we are doing this. It'll be a good idea. If some of you are interested, must join that. I'll send you the link, Hans. You can share it with the students. But then law is becoming more and more critical, because as balance of power, as contentions, nationalism, sovereignty, knowledge and practice of international law will become more and more critical. We are entering into a phase when at sea, there will be ships, of course, they're not going away. You'll have unmanned ships. We're already into that. We are talking about unmanned cars. We're talking about unmanned ships. So there'll be a big mothership, all right, which will be manned. There'll be 7 or 8 babies around, baby ships around. As they are approaching, say, port of, say, Chennai, right? This mothership says, okay, baby, one, you go to Chennai, discharge your cargo, pick up cargo, come back and join me. Unmanned, autonomous. This is not science fiction. This is going to be a reality in 5 to 7 years. Trials are already going on in amongst the Norwegian waters, right? But then you find that this is the shape of things to come. But do we have the laws for this? Not yet. Are we thinking about it? Not yet. But of course, those who are going to be coming on board for such things, they're already thinking about this, trying to build up on that. So our knowledge, my understanding is that our knowledge of, including us, I mean, practitioners like me who've been in this business, our knowledge of international maritime law, law of the sea is still pretty weak. We still hire, for the purpose of our cases, overseas lawyers, foreign lawyers. That's the weakness that we have. So this is another area in which, students get excited. This is another discipline or domain in which to invest in.
Is there any?
Sir, I have a question.
Sure.
Since your map spoke about the choke points thing, the theory was propounded by the former NSA of USA, I think Brzezinski, who spoke about choke points and other thing called linchpin states. And do you think which state in the Southeast Asian region can act as a linchpin state to encounter or to check the hegemonic status of China? Because you were speaking about Japan and the ASEAN states and its alignment with its alliance with USA. So, which state has the potentiality to act as a linchpin state according to the theory of Brzezinski?
See, we have a very sophisticated body of law for the purpose of choke points, sea lanes of choke points. I mean, no one controls this. We call as international sea lanes, ISL, right? In which the littoral states have rights limited, but duties phenomenal. That means they must keep the states open, etc., etc. So it is not plausible to say, okay, tomorrow Singapore gets up in the morning and says, okay, I'm stopping the Straits of Malacca. Not possible. The Iranians try to do that, Straits of Hormuz. So we'll choke these Straits of Hormuz, but then suddenly there's so much of pressure on them. And this happens frequently, but not of late, but it used to happen very frequently a couple of years ago. And every time there would be an announcement, we're going to mine the Straits of Hormuz. But then at some stage, we also realized that the pirates were literally on at the mouth of, say, Bab el Mandab, which is going up into Suez and then into the Mediterranean. You have special regimes listed out in the law of the sea, which tell you what are the duties, responsibility, what is the international sea lane. And there are archipelagic sea lanes. After all, Philippines archipelagic. They have 10 archipelagic sea lanes on which they control. Singapore, in Indonesia, right? Sunda, Lombok, international sea lanes. You don't just say, I'm going to stop, because you are a signatory to the law of the sea. That means you are committed to it. It's not easy to choke the choke point. The concept of linchpin is a very amorphous subject. Okay, you please ensure that this happens and that happens. A linchpin in my schema, in my strategy, etc., etc. But purely, I mean, these two will be two different things altogether. In classic terms, choke point, narrow passage, international sea lane, right? There is a law, you have to abide by it. You invite a lot of fluck, right? You just can't stop anybody. And then there's a regime, states follow, sometimes they don't follow. Let me give you an example. Like the United States, whenever they have a commitment, what they call as that, they say that we will not declare when our nuclear platforms are transiting through the sea lanes in the Southeast Asian waters. So there are issues of very interesting nature, legal, geopolitics, rights, duties. So your question is very, very good. Excellent. But this is how you should start looking at it, that it is no carte blanche, linchpin, sea lane, I choke it, I stop the international traffic. Not plausible.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for Thank you, sir, for patiently responding to our questions. I thank all the fellow students for their active participation. Before we close, may I request Asupal, second MA, to kindly propose the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Association of Political Science, Madras Christian College, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the Lord God for His endless grace. I would also like to express my heartfelt thanks to our respected speaker, Dr. Vijay Shakuja. Thank you, sir, for such an informative and an engaging lecture. I would finally like to thank each and every member of the Department of Political Science. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's indeed been a pleasure to listen to you, and we are grateful for the information that you've given to us. We really appreciate your kindness and even willing to come and talk to us. Thank you very much.
All the best, professors. Have a great day ahead. You have a long day.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Children will miss the unofficial talk that they could have had with you after the lecture over a working lunch.
I always say, willing.
If it was offline.
God willing, one day this will get over and we will be able to meet. And when I visit Chennai, it'll be my, endeavor to come and meet you guys.
Yeah.
And of course, enjoy idli dosa, which I always love when I come to Chennai.